So what do you think the inspiration behind the Marble House meetings was?
The Marble House meeting, it depends on how deep you want to go into the history. If you go back, the landmark or watershed event in women's rights in the United States was the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. And Julia Ward Howe, who had long-standing connections to Newport and whose family spent summers in Newport when she was growing up, attended that convention. And so she kind of came back to Newport with the women's suffrage and abolitionist message that had come up at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And that's a big deal to me because I grew up in Seneca Falls. So that's part of the story. But then in 1868, after the Boston Women's Convention comes together, there are two Rhode Island women who come back and decide that Rhode Island needs to approach women's suffrage from the state-by-state level. And all along throughout the women's suffrage movement, there seems to be this tension between people who say we should go for Congress and the federal government and get a constitutional amendment first, and the other side whose strategy is let's go state by state. So the Rhode Island state group decides in 1868, and it was one of the first states to have its own state women's suffrage association. They, the following year in 1869, hold the National Women's Suffrage Association meeting here in Newport. Every year for the next 40 years, the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association goes to the state legislature and petitions to have women's suffrage introduced into the state legislature as a bill. They get their first shot in 1887, and Rhode Island is in fact the first state to put women's suffrage up for a vote in the legislature. Gets voted down. But they keep trying and trying and trying. Meanwhile, women's suffrage overall in England and the United States is growing as a movement right before the First World War. In the case of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, in and I have to check the date, I think it's 1908 that her husband, Oliver Belmont, dies. She goes to England to sort of recover and grieve. Her daughter, Consuelo, who's the Duchess of Marlborough, has gotten involved in the women's suffrage movement in England, which is much more advanced. There's Emmeline Pankhurst, who is very radical, and she's throwing bombs and getting arrested and going on hunger strikes and extremely controversial politically. Consuelo supports the idea of women's suffrage because she feels that it's the way to address poverty amongst women and children, but she doesn't support these radical tactics. Alva, on the other hand, goes to a lecture by Emmeline Pankhurst and is like, yeah, let's do this. Let's start throwing bombs. Let's start rocking the boat. So she comes back to the United States all fired up. And in fact invites Emmeline Pankhurst to come in 1909 and speak in the United States. And that's when she gets really worked up and gets involved with the different women's suffrage groups that are starting in the United States. And they are, again, really divided between the people who think we need to be very diplomatic and we need to petition the legislature, and the ones who are like, no, we need to chain ourselves to buildings. We need to just, raise all the hell we can. So the first Marble House rallies in 1909 show that Alva was very aware that as a wealthy woman, she was viewed with suspicion by other suffragettes because the suffragettes were really tied to helping working women as well as just women in general. Alva said to them, if I host this event and get my daughter, the Duchess, to come, you're going to get the leaders of society, the most influential people, to attend. You're going to get their attention in a way that they're never going to invite you into their offices or their living rooms. But if I have a fancy party at Marble House and have my daughter, the Duchess, there, I guarantee you everybody will show up. And that's exactly what she did. And the press flocked to the event, and they got more publicity for Alva's party because it combined the sort of social titillation, and people were dying to see how these fancy society ladies responded to these rough and tumble suffragettes. So it gave this enormous boost of publicity and momentum to the women's movement. She has another one in 1914, actually two, at the Chinese Tea House. But the Chinese Tea House, even before it officially opens on July 8th, 1914, she has another suffragette rally. Same strategy. You know, I'm going to bring the Duchess, and I have this new building that everybody's dying to see. And on the inside of the Chinese Tea House are panels with Chinese writing. And when they're translated, they're all about the power of women. And the Chinese Tea House was actually based on a building that belonged to the Empress's summer palace in China. So it was Chinese, but it was also all imagery about powerful women. And so Alva kept bringing this publicity and also contributing a lot of money to the women's suffrage movement. In 1917, Rhode Island finally made a concession, and women in Rhode Island got the vote for presidential elections only. They still couldn't vote in state and local elections, but for presidential elections, they were allowed to vote. Alva continued to fund and publicize the women's movement, becoming more and more radical. And right around 1916-17, there was a very dramatic event. There was a famous suffragette woman named Inez Milholland, and she was an attorney. And she was really good looking, which didn't hurt for publicity either. She was sort of a protege of Alva. She attended a suffragette parade in Los Angeles and dropped dead at the end. And her dying words were, "Mr. President," I guess she would have been speaking to Woodrow Wilson, "Mr. President, when will women get their liberty?" And she just keels over. So she becomes this huge martyr to the cause. And it's sort of that last boost that the women's movement really needs, is this martyr figure. And they've been marching in front of the White House and petitioning Woodrow Wilson and just raising all kinds of hell. But this is sort of the final straw. And then in 1919, the federal government, both houses of Congress, passed the Women's Suffrage Act, and it becomes an amendment, and all the states have to ratify it. And in 1920, with the final vote, the final state was Tennessee, it became law.
Like, they publicized it nationally, so they're all, then I look at newspapers, there's articles all over from like Oregon, Washington, writing about the Marble House meetings. So would you say that was one of the lasting like effects of the Marble House meetings, sort of like putting the suffrage movement on the national stage when it wasn't before? Or?
I think it was on the national stage, but again, I think what the Marble House rallies and Alva Vanderbilt as a strategist, learning that you could get people's attention. I mean, it was really very modern. You know, she had a very modern attitude towards using her own celebrity and her daughter's celebrity to draw attention. So the same way today, when you have a celebrity, you have George Clooney or Sean Penn. Like when Sean Penn goes to Haiti after they've had a hurricane or an earthquake, all of a sudden the press follows it because they want to know what he's doing. I think she was very much ahead of the time in using the celebrity status to put forward her political agenda. And part of the mystique of Newport, and Newport as an elite, exclusive resort, that all of a sudden the press was invited into a Newport party. They weren't going to get invited to a private party at one of these, you know, at Mimi Fish's or Tessie Ulrich's house. They weren't going to invite the press in. But because this was a political rally, the press had a chance to see the inside of the house. They got to see the Gothic room. They got to hear, you know, they talked about all the people buying tickets. She charged admission just to tour the house. And then the money went to the women's suffrage movement. So she was playing on her identity with the public as this gateway to this rich, privileged world that wasn't accessible otherwise. And she used that to lure them in. And then once she got them there, she sort of slapped them around, beat them over the head with the women's suffrage message. I think it's also interesting that, you know, Rhode Island was so early in the women's suffrage movement overall, and that the women were meeting for all these years in Newport. And so even before Alva, there was a legacy in Newport through women like Julia Ward Howe, who Alva trotted out at her 1909, her first suffragette rally at Marble House. Julia Ward Howe was like 100 years old and in a wheelchair. Alva personally wheeled her out. The woman who had written the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the last survivor of the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, and just rolled her out there, and poor Julia Ward Howe was kind of slumped over, as this symbol. And so here are Rhode Island associated women, Rhode Islanders, who are becoming these national symbols of the struggle for women's suffrage.